Princess Anne had entered the morning believing the hearing would settle a minor dispute over sealed royal correspondence. Instead, one sentence from the court changed everything. A private set of papers prepared for King Charles, documents discussing the possibility of his abdication and the transfer of responsibility to William, had been deliberately withheld from the royal family. And according to the court record, Camilla had known exactly where those papers were. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Anne did not move when the disclosure was read again. Sitting near the legal team, she stopped turning the pages, lowered her glasses, and stared toward the barristers as surprise hardened into disbelief. The court was stating something clear. Camilla had concealed private papers, in which Charles explored stepping aside, set out possible conditions for leaving the throne, and considered giving William greater constitutional responsibility. An abdication document is paperwork connected to a monarch voluntarily giving up the throne, a decision that reshapes the succession and places the next heir at the center of royal authority. That was why these papers could never be ordinary family correspondence. Charles felt the blow differently. He recognized phrases drawn from private conversations he believed had remained contained, and when one passage was quoted, the king set down his pen. He knew the danger was no longer that he had once considered leaving. The deeper wound was that someone had decided who could know. Camilla's position became more difficult when attached correspondence showed the documents had passed through a private office under her control before vanishing from the normal palace filing chain. She had not destroyed them, she had preserved them and kept them beyond the reach of people whose futures depended on those pages. Anne's disbelief turned colder. William, receiving the news away from the chamber, asked one question first: had his father personally signed the papers? The answer was devastating. Several pages carried Charles's handwritten notes and initials, proving the monarch himself had reviewed them. The prince understood at once that the hidden file touched his future, yet he had never been told it existed. That was the mystery now tightening around Camilla. She had not merely hidden correspondence. She had concealed evidence that Charles had seriously considered the circumstances under which he might relinquish the crown, and Anne wanted to know why she believed that choice belonged to her. And as Anne began to understand what had been concealed, the court's revelation forced everyone to confront the people whose lives would have been transformed had those papers surfaced when Charles first wrote them. The documents were explosive, but paper alone could not explain the damage. Behind every handwritten note stood 4 people bound together by blood, marriage, duty, and a secret none of them understood in quite the same way. Charles had considered surrendering the burden. Camilla had kept the evidence hidden. William had unknowingly stood on the edge of kingship. And Anne was now being forced to decide whom she could still trust. Charles carried the weight differently from everyone else. The papers showed a monarch examining what might happen if illness, pressure, or personal strain made continuing impossible, not a man casually abandoning duty. An heir is the person next in line to the throne, and any phased transfer of duties would place William closer to responsibilities normally exercised by the sovereign. That was why the prince felt disturbed rather than ambitious. Others had discussed the shape of his future without ever inviting him into the room. Anne felt loyalty pulling against judgment. She had spent decades understanding that royal survival often depended on discretion. But this was not simply a private family embarrassment. Succession concerns the legal order in which the crown passes from one monarch to the next, and hiding papers tied to that process crossed a boundary she could not ignore. Camilla, meanwhile, defended her choice in a private documented account, insisting she had acted during a period when Charles was exhausted and vulnerable. She believed the papers captured temporary fear, not settled intention. Anne found her brother shortly after the hearing. She asked him directly whether he knew the papers had been removed from circulation. Charles paused, and the silence answered before he did. "No," the king finally said. Yet he immediately asked his sister not to condemn Camilla before hearing the full history. That request unsettled Anne more than anger would have, because it showed that he felt betrayed and still wanted to protect his wife. William then learned that one draft discussed a gradual transfer of duties to the heir. He understood the issue was no longer ambition, but consent. The future king had been expected to prepare for a possibility he had never been told existed. Camilla received a private message soon afterward, confirming that Anne now knew Charles had never authorized the paper's disappearance. She read it twice, and gave no reply. The conflict had moved beyond procedure. It was family now, and every silence carried weight. And the reason was buried months earlier. To understand why those papers disappeared, the story must return to one private night, when a conversation between Charles and William pushed the monarchy toward a point nobody inside the family could later forget. Long before the courtroom revelation, there had been a night the family quietly buried. Charles was tired, William was worried, and Camilla had heard enough to recognize that something had changed. It was not a formal announcement. No cameras were present. Yet during one private conversation, the king allowed himself to say what everyone around him had been afraid to imagine. There might come a moment when William would have to take over. Charles asked his son to remain behind after a difficult family dinner at Windsor, and the silence between them carried more weight than anything said at the table. The two spoke without aids about the strain of kingship, the pressure of public duty, and what would happen if the monarchy faced a sudden transition. A succession briefing is a private planning process that sets out how royal duties, public responsibilities, and constitutional arrangements could be handled if the sovereign could no longer continue. It was not an abdication, but it created a path in case that possibility became real. William listened as his father finally said the words that changed everything. William may have to take it sooner than either of us expected. The prince did not answer quickly. He understood that Charles was not surrendering the crown in that moment. He was admitting fear. Yet once that sentence existed, it could not be forgotten. And the future king left believing the conversation would remain between them, unless circumstances truly changed. Camilla learned later that legal advisors had expanded the briefing into draft abdication papers. She became deeply disturbed, convinced that preparation was turning Charles's exhaustion into something dangerously permanent. When she found him reviewing one version alone, the queen consort asked whether he intended to sign it. He told her he did not know, but he wanted William protected from chaos if the situation ever became impossible. Camilla heard something else in those words. She feared the documents could become a mechanism for removing a man who had waited most of his life to inherit the throne. Days later, a sealed packet intended for the monarch's legal office was redirected through her private secretary and placed among restricted personal correspondence. Charles believed the papers remained available. William assumed the conversation had ended. Anne knew nothing. That was the hidden trigger. Camilla had not concealed random papers. She acted after hearing Charles admit directly to William that an early transfer of power might one day become necessary. And once Anne learned that truth, lawyers were no longer enough. She wanted the queen consort face to face. And when Anne finally demanded that meeting, years of loyalty, resentment, and buried fear were compressed into a confrontation neither woman could escape. There were no barristers between them now. No carefully prepared statements. No court official controlling the room. Anne entered knowing precisely what she wanted to hear, and Camilla understood that polished explanations would no longer be enough. When the door closed, the princess did not begin with an accusation. She placed a copy of the court disclosure on the table and asked one devastating question. "Did Charles tell you to hide these?" Camilla held Anne's gaze and answered without delay. No. Charles had never instructed her to remove the papers. The queen consort had made that decision herself, and the admission changed the room instantly. Anne understood that a constitutional file, meaning a document tied to the legal functioning and future of the crown, had been controlled by personal judgment. She asked whether Camilla understood that William's future, the line of succession, and the stability of the monarchy were all tied to those pages. The question was no longer about marriage. It was about authority. Camilla pushed back with equal force. She told Anne that others saw legal preparation, while she saw an exhausted husband being encouraged to imagine his own departure at his weakest moment. She had watched Charles carry pressure, fear, and duty until the papers began to feel less like protection and more like a pathway others might use against him. Anne listened, but her expression hardened. She told the Queen Consort that protecting Charles did not give anyone the right to decide what William was allowed to know. Anne moved the file across the table. "Silence," she said, "becomes control when it changes another person's future." Camilla finally admitted what had frightened her most. Once lawyers, advisors, and William began discussing abdication, she feared the idea would gain momentum, and Charles would feel trapped into leaving before he truly chose to go. The confession revealed her motive, but it did not erase the consequence. Anne stood to leave. Camilla stopped her with one question. Would she truly have behaved differently if she believed her brother was being pushed toward the door? The princess paused with one hand against the chair. Then she answered. She would have fought the proposal openly. She would have challenged everyone involved. But she would not have hidden it. Charles learned about the confrontation soon afterward, and the king was shaken by what his private doubts had become. His possible departure had fractured trust between two women closest to his royal life. Yet neither Anne nor Camilla controlled what came next. The family could argue about motives, but motive alone could no longer contain the crisis. The next battle would be over. Who possessed the power to decide what the hidden papers now required? By the next morning, Camilla's explanation mattered emotionally, but institutionally, the machinery had already begun moving without her. Copies of the papers were secured. Legal advisors were separating personal reflections from constitutional preparation. William was being briefed, and Charles was suddenly confronted with the most uncomfortable truth of all. The documents he once created as protection against chaos had become the very source of chaos inside his family. William entered the legal briefing, determined to stop one danger before it began. He told the advisors that no decision was to be presented as something done in his name. The prince would not allow his father's private doubts to become a shortcut to the throne. The Privy Council, a formal body of senior advisors connected to the monarch, could not simply force a sovereign to abdicate, but succession questions made its role impossible to ignore. That was why every sentence in the file now carried weight beyond the family. Camilla felt the shift when the court ordered the concealed papers to remain secured for examination, rather than returned to any private household office. Her request for some correspondence was partially refused, and the Queen Consort understood the consequence immediately. The material she had tried to shield was now being studied by people outside her control. Anne supported that decision, not from revenge, but because she believed trust could not recover while the chain of custody remained hidden or uncertain. William stayed behind after the meeting with one copied page in front of him. His father's handwriting sat beside a succession clause, and the future king closed the folder before reading further. Charles was then told that the papers themselves did not force abdication. The question was whether their concealment had blocked instructions he had already authorized and prevented legitimate advisors from acting as intended. Then, the deeper wound appeared. Anne read an accompanying note showing that Charles had written the papers should remain accessible to William if circumstances materially change. The sentence proved the heir had never been meant to remain permanently outside the discussion. Camilla had not simply hidden uncertainty. She had prevented a condition written by the king himself from being followed. Charles received the note in silence. He recognized the words instantly, because they were his. Camilla had believed she was protecting him from pressure, but now the monarch faced a harder truth. Protection had crossed into decision-making. Anne saw the change in her brother before he said a word. William did too. The cost had become personal. Because when Charles finally saw the sentence he himself had written for William, he could no longer avoid asking what Camilla's protection had actually cost him. Charles had defended Camilla when others questioned her motives. He had asked Anne for patience. He had warned William against rushing to judgment. But the handwritten instruction changed him. There it was in his own words. If circumstances changed, the file was to be made available to his son. Camilla had not merely hidden a frightening possibility. She had unknowingly, or knowingly, prevented one of Charles's own carefully written wishes from being carried out. Charles read the page alone, before asking Camilla to join him. He did not begin with anger. The king pointed to the handwritten instruction and asked whether she had seen it before the papers were removed. The queen consort answered yes. That single word closed off the easiest explanation. The instruction had not been missed. A succession-related document is material tied to the transfer or future exercise of royal authority, which meant Charles had written those words knowing they might one day affect William directly. Camilla tried to explain that she believed the note reflected fear, not settled judgment. She thought the pressure surrounding abdication would pass, and that Charles would later be relieved the papers had not gained momentum. He listened without raising his voice. Then the monarch told her the choice had still been his to reconsider. By removing the file, she had taken away his chance to return to his own decision on his own terms. That was the wound neither of them could soften. Charles acted immediately. He removed all succession-related correspondence from Camilla's household circulation and ordered future crown material to pass only through designated constitutional offices, meaning the official channels responsible for handling matters tied to the monarch's legal role. Anne learned of the change and felt no victory. She understood what it meant for her brother to establish formal boundaries inside his own marriage, and the princess found that consequence sadder than any public confrontation. William spoke with his father soon afterward. The prince told Charles he did not want the throne through exhaustion, scandal, or pressure. If succession came, it had to come, because the king had made a free and unmistakable choice. Charles absorbed those words quietly. For the first time since the papers surfaced, he understood that his son was not demanding power. He was demanding honesty. Camilla now faced the consequence she had tried hardest to prevent. Her attempt to stop an abdication crisis had made Charles's future impossible to avoid, and weakened her influence over what happened next. And behind a closed door, stripped of titles, advisors, and competing loyalties, Charles and William finally confronted the question that had haunted every page of the secret file. For days, everyone else had spoken around the question. Lawyers discussed procedure. Anne spoke about trust. Camilla spoke about protection. Commentators prepared for succession drama. But finally Charles and William sat together without advisors and without a document open between them. The father looked at the son who might one day replace him and admitted what the hidden papers had always represented. Not a plan to escape, but a fear of failing before he knew when to stop. Charles told William that the papers had been drafted because duty could become its own trap. He feared reaching a point where loyalty to the crown might stop him from recognizing his limits. A contingency plan is simply a prepared course of action for a crisis that may never happen, and the king said that was how he had seen the abdication drafts. They were protection against chaos, not a secret countdown to departure. Yet he admitted that hiding them had changed their meaning completely. William answered with unusual calm. The prince said preparation itself had never been the betrayal. What hurt was learning that Charles had intended him to have access if circumstances changed, only for someone else to decide he should remain unaware. He then made one promise clear. He would not press for abdication, and he would not allow the papers to become leverage against his father. The future king wanted no throne gained through exhaustion, panic, or humiliation. Charles felt the pressure ease for the first time since the hearing. He asked his son whether he still trusted his judgment. William did not give him an easy answer. Trust, he said, did not mean pretending mistakes never happened. It meant allowing the person responsible to correct them. That distinction reached the king more deeply than reassurance alone could have done. William then proposed that the drafts remain preserved but inactive, available only as emergency material, rather than a roadmap for immediate change. He also asked that Anne be included in future family discussions about succession. The princess had proved that loyalty did not require silence when boundaries were crossed. Charles agreed, accepting that Camilla would remain his wife and emotional partner, but constitutional matters could no longer depend on her personal discretion. Charles later sought Anne and told her directly that he would not abdicate because of scandal. She answered that she had never wanted him forced out. She wanted him free to choose. The family had finally reached clarity. Now the country would judge what that clarity had cost. What had begun behind closed doors could no longer remain there, and when the story reached the public, one image outside Buckingham Palace captured just how deeply the revelation had struck. In the end, Charles did not abdicate. William did not seize control. Anne did not walk away from her brother. And Camilla was not expelled from the life they had built together. But nothing simply returned to normal. The hidden papers had exposed something more dangerous than a succession plan. The moment when love, fear, and royal power became impossible to separate. To survive it, the family had to draw a line none of them could cross again. Charles made the decision himself. The abdication drafts would remain archived as contingency documents, meaning emergency papers preserved for a crisis that might never happen. They would not be activated, destroyed, or hidden again. The king would continue because he chose to continue, not because anyone had shielded him from another option. William accepted that decision. The prince carried greater responsibility, but refused to treat scandal as a shortcut toward the crown. Anne received something quieter. Charles told his sister privately that she had been right to challenge the concealment, even when doing so hurt the family. She answered that loyalty sometimes demanded discomfort, because silence would have protected the secret rather than her brother. Camilla faced the clearest consequence. She remained beside Charles, but the queen consort lost any informal role in handling succession papers, abdication planning, or documents connected to the constitutional authority of the heir. Camilla finally told Charles she had believed she was saving him from a decision made during his weakest period. He answered that love could protect someone from pressure, but never from their own right to choose. She accepted it. It did not erase what happened, yet it ended the argument over whether concealment could ever be justified as protection. Charles then met William and Anne together and made one promise clear: if he ever reconsidered his position, secrecy would not control the process. The monarchy emerged bruised but stable. Anne's frozen reaction now meant something different. She had never feared that abdication was discussed. She had feared that someone believed they could control who was allowed to know. Camilla's concealment failed because protection had crossed into authority. Charles reclaimed his future. William proved patience could be stronger than ambition. Anne proved loyalty did not require silence. The papers remained sealed in the archive, Charles remained on the throne, and the family moved forward under one irreversible understanding. No matter how painful the truth might become, nobody would ever again be allowed to hide the future of the crown from the people whose lives depended upon it. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.